Bernadette Walker was a 17-year-old girl from Peterborough, UK. And let me tell you, this wasn't just any teenage girl. She had dreams, ambitions, creativity, and a personality that shined through even in the darkest of times. She wasn't the loudest person in the room, but she had a presence. She had this artistic soul, you know. She loved photography, loved capturing moments, like she was freezing time with her camera. And she was good at it too. It wasn't just snapping selfies or taking random pictures, she had a real eye for it. The kind of eye that sees things others miss. And that's kind of poetic, right? Because in the end, people missed seeing what was really happening to her. She had a unique style, gothic, alternative, that dark aesthetic that a lot of creative minds gravitate towards. It wasn't just about looking different. It was about expression, about finding an identity in a world that didn't always feel welcoming. She wore dark clothes, bold makeup, and had that mix of shyness and defiance, like she knew she was different and wasn't going to apologize for it. And honestly, that's badass. She loved writing too, poetry, personal thoughts. She had this whole inner world that only a few people got to see. And she was funny, in that dry, sarcastic way. You know, the type quiet, but when they say something, it's so perfectly timed you just have to laugh. She wasn't the kind of teenager who was out partying every night or getting into trouble. No, she was just trying to figure out who she was, like every 17-year-old. But unlike most, she had something dark looming over her every single day. Because here's the thing, while the outside world saw this creative, quiet, kind of mysterious girl, her home life was something else entirely. It wasn't safe. It wasn't loving. It wasn't what a teenage girl deserves. Now, when you think of parents, you think of protection, right? You think of safety, warmth, someone who's always in your corner. But Bernadette, she didn't get that. Instead, she got Scott and Sarah Walker, two people who, let's be honest, should have never been responsible for another human life. Scott Walker was her stepfather, but he had been in her life since she was a toddler, so to her, he was just dad. He was the one who was supposed to be her protector, but instead, he was her worst nightmare. And then there was Sarah Walker, her mother. And let me tell you, calling this woman a mother is almost insulting to the word itself, because when Bernadette needed her the most, she didn't just fail her, she betrayed her in the most unforgivable way possible. From the outside, Bernadette's life looked normal enough. She had younger siblings, she went to school, she had friends, she did photography. But behind closed doors, she was living in fear. Because for years, Scott Walker was doing something that no father figure should ever do. He was abusing her, stealing her innocence, taking advantage of her vulnerability. And she kept quiet, probably because she felt she had no choice. I mean, who was going to believe her? What was she supposed to do? But then one day she did it. She found the courage. She decided enough was enough. She told the one person who was supposed to protect her, no matter what, her mother. Now, if you're thinking, finally, her nightmare is over, I hate to break it to you, but no. That's not how this story goes. Because Sarah Walker didn't protect her daughter. She protected her husband instead. Let that sink in. Your daughter comes to you, tells you she's being abused by the man you brought into her life, and instead of standing by her, you side with him. This wasn't just betrayal. It was a death sentence. Because 2 days later, Bernadette was gone. Sarah may not have been the one to do it, but make no mistake, her hands are just as dirty as Scott's. Because if she had done the right thing, if she had chosen her daughter over her monster of a husband, Bernadette might still be here today. But she didn't. And Scott, well, Scott made sure Bernadette would never speak up again. So yeah, Bernadette Walker wasn't just a girl from Peterborough. She was a fighter, a dreamer, an artist, a survivor until she wasn't given the chance to survive anymore. Alright, so picture this. You're 17 years old. You've spent your whole life feeling unsafe, feeling like there's this dark cloud looming over you, and no matter what you do, you can't escape it. For years, something has been happening to you, something awful, unspeakable. And the worst part, the person doing it to you is someone you're supposed to trust, someone who pretends to be your protector. But instead of keeping you safe, he's the one causing you pain. That's exactly what Bernadette Walker was going through. For years, she had been suffering in silence. Scott Walker, her stepfather, was not the loving father figure people might have assumed he was. No, he was a predator. And behind closed doors, he was doing unspeakable things to Bernadette. Now, if you've ever wondered why victims don't always come forward right away, this case tells you exactly why. Because imagine being trapped in a home with your abuser, knowing that if you spoke up, things could get even worse. Imagine carrying that fear every single day, having to act normal, sit across from this person at the dinner table, hear them say "I love you" like everything is fine, when in reality, your entire world is collapsing. That's the psychological hell Bernadette was living in. But then one day she couldn't take it anymore. Something inside her finally broke. Maybe she had reached her limit. Maybe she realized that if she didn't speak up now, she never would. Maybe she finally believed, even just for a moment, that someone would listen. So she did it. She found the courage to say the words out loud. She told her mother. She told Sarah Walker, the one person in the world who was supposed to love her unconditionally, protect her, fight for her, believe her. Now, in a just world, this would have been the turning point. This would have been the moment where Sarah held her daughter tight and said, "I've got you. We're getting out of here. He'll never hurt you again." But this world, it's not always just. And Sarah Walker, she was no mother. Because when Bernadette finally opened up, when she laid her soul bare and told her mother about the nightmare she had been living through, Sarah didn't believe her. No, worse than that. She refused to believe her. She didn't comfort her. She didn't cry for her. She didn't call the police. She didn't do a damn thing to protect her daughter. Instead, she sided with Scott. She chose the man who had been abusing her daughter for years over her own child. Let that sink in. Your daughter finally comes forward with something that has been destroying her life, and instead of standing by her, you betray her in the worst possible way. Now, let's be clear, Sarah didn't just doubt Bernadette. She actively participated in covering for Scott. And in that moment, Bernadette must have realized something horrifying. She was alone. Her abuser wasn't just Scott. It was both of them. Because the moment Sarah refused to believe her, she signed Bernadette's death warrant. Now think about what Bernadette must have felt in that moment. The sheer hopelessness of it. She had finally done the hardest thing imaginable. She had spoken up, only to be shut down in the most soul-crushing way possible. What do you do when the one person who is supposed to be your safe place tells you you're lying? That kind of betrayal. It's worse than anything. And 2 days later, she was gone. Because Scott Walker? He wasn't about to let Bernadette ruin his little secret. She had spoken up, and now he had to silence her forever. All right. So it's July 18th, 2020. Just another summer day in Peterborough. Nothing out of the ordinary. But for Bernadette Walker, this day would be the last day anyone would ever see her alive. She had been staying at her grandparents' house the night before. Now we don't know exactly what was going through her mind that morning, but we do know why she was there. She had been staying with them after a massive argument with her mother, Sarah Walker. And why were they arguing? Because Bernadette had done something incredibly brave. She had accused her stepfather, Scott Walker, of sexual abuse. She had spoken up about years of trauma, finally breaking her silence. And what did her mother do? Did she comfort her? Did she believe her? Did she protect her? No, she took Scott's side. That argument must have been horrific. Imagine Bernadette standing there begging her mother to listen, only for Sarah to shut her down, to gaslight her, to tell her that she was lying, to choose her abuser over her, to completely abandon her when she needed her most. So, in the aftermath of all that, Bernadette had gone to stay at her grandparents' house. Maybe she felt safer there. Maybe she needed space to breathe, to figure out what to do next. Maybe, for just a second, she thought that everything would be okay. But Scott Walker had other plans. That morning, he got into his car and drove to pick her up. Now, let's just stop for a second and think about this. Why him? Sarah Walker could have picked up Bernadette. Her grandparents could have driven her home. Literally anyone else could have been the one to go and get her. But no, it was Scott, the very man she had accused. The man who knew that if she told the police, his entire life would be over. The second Bernadette got into that car, her fate was sealed. Now Scott tells the police later that on the drive home, Bernadette suddenly jumped out of the car and ran away. Right. A 17-year-old girl with no money, no phone, and nowhere to go, just randomly threw herself out of a moving vehicle and vanished into thin air. That's his story. That's what he wants us to believe. Because let's be real, that didn't happen. Bernadette never ran away. She never jumped out of that car. She never even made it home. Because at some point on that car ride, Scott Walker killed her. We don't know exactly how he did it. We don't know if he strangled her, if he suffocated her, if he used something else entirely. But what we do know, he made her disappear. After that drive, Bernadette was never seen again. No kid footage, no sightings, no messages, nothing. She was just gone. And Scott, well, instead of being, a devastated father searching for his missing daughter, he spent the next few hours getting rid of her body. And whatever he did, wherever he took her, he made sure no one would ever find her. Because to this day, Bernadette's body has never been recovered. And if that doesn't make your blood boil, just wait. Because what happened next, it's even worse. Scott Walker had to come up with a story. He had no choice. Because let's be honest, when a 17-year-old girl vanishes without a trace, the first question anyone asks is, where was she last seen? Who was she last with? And in Bernadette's case, the answer to both of those questions was Scott Walker. He knew it. He knew that all eyes were going to be on him. So what does he do? He panics. He scrambles for a story, an excuse, a lie, something that would take the heat off him. And what does he come up with? She ran away. That's it. That's his big explanation. According to Scott, he picked Bernadette up from her grandparents' house on the morning of July 18th, 2020. They were driving back home when suddenly, out of nowhere, she threw open the car door, jumped out and ran off. Just like that. No warning. No reason. Now I don't know about you, but that doesn't sound believable for a second. Because let's break this down. First of all, why would she run away? Think about it. Bernadette had just done the hardest thing imaginable. She had told the truth about what Scott was doing to her. She had finally spoken up. That takes incredible strength and courage. So why, after all of that, would she suddenly flee into the unknown with no money, no phone, and no plan? And let's not forget, Scott was the one person she was terrified of. He was her abuser, her tormentor, the man who had stolen years of her life. And she was alone in a car with him. If anything, Bernadette was in danger, not running away, being taken somewhere she didn't want to go. But Scott, he tells everyone, oh, she just ran off. I don't know where she went. Now, if that were true, where's the evidence? Where are the witnesses? Peterborough isn't some remote wilderness. It's a city. If a teenage girl had suddenly vaulted from a moving car and taken off running, someone would have seen something. Where's the sect footage? We live in a world where cameras are everywhere. Traffic cameras, security cameras, dash cams. If Bernadette had really gotten out of that car and run away, there should have been at least one video proving it. But guess what? There isn't. Because it never happened. There is zero evidence to support Scott Walker's claim. Not a single shred of proof. No camera caught Bernadette running. No one saw her on the streets. No one reported her hitchhiking or boarding a bus or doing anything at all. It's like she just ceased to exist. And that's because she never left that car. Scott's story was a pathetic excuse, a desperate attempt to shift blame, to make it seem like Bernadette's disappearance was her own fault. And let's be real, he was lying from the start. Because the second he claimed she had run away, his actions didn't match his words. Think about it. If your child had just jumped out of your car and vanished, what would you do? You'd be panicked. You'd be searching everywhere. You'd be calling the police immediately. You'd be begging people to help find her. But Scott, he didn't do any of that. In fact, he waited before even reporting her missing. He wasn't in a rush. He wasn't concerned, because he already knew the truth. And the truth was Bernadette never ran away. She was murdered. And Scott Walker was the only one who knew where her body was. Imagine this. A 17-year-old girl disappears. No one sees her. No one hears from her. But her phone, her phone is still active. Messages are still being sent. Posts are still being made. At first glance, it looks like she's still out there somewhere. Maybe she really did run away, just like Scott Walker claimed. Maybe she just needed time to herself. Maybe she didn't want to be found. That's exactly what Scott and Sarah Walker wanted everyone to think. Because while the world was wondering where Bernadette Walker had gone, her own parents already knew the answer. She was dead. And instead of telling the truth, instead of reporting her missing immediately, instead of doing what any real parent would do, they came up with something far more sinister. They pretended she was still alive. For weeks after Bernadette was last seen, Scott and Sarah Walker kept up the illusion that nothing was wrong. They took her phone, logged into her accounts, and started texting people as if they were her. Think about how twisted that is. Your own child is gone, and instead of grieving, instead of breaking down in guilt, you sit there typing out messages, carefully crafting a lie to cover your track. They sent texts to her friends, to family members, even to themselves, to make it seem like Bernadette had simply chosen to disappear. Sarah, the woman who was supposed to be Bernadette's mother, even texted Bernadette's phone from her own number, and then replied as Bernadette, creating fake conversations that made it look like she had run away on purpose. They were playing a sick, twisted game, making it seem like Bernadette was out there somewhere, alive but just not ready to come home. It wasn't just texts either. They posted from her social media accounts, making it look like she was still active. A message here, a little status update. They're just enough to convince people that she was out there somewhere, just off the grid for a little while. They knew exactly what they were doing. They were buying time, trying to make people believe that Bernadette was still alive so that no one would start asking questions. And at first, it worked. Friends and family believed the messages. Why wouldn't they? No one wanted to think the worst. No one wanted to believe that something terrible had happened. But here's the thing about lies: they fall apart. Because no matter how hard Scott and Sarah tried, they couldn't fake being Bernadette forever. Her friends noticed that the way she texted didn't seem right. The wording was off. The tone was different. Some of the things she was saying just didn't sound like her. And then, the biggest mistake of all, she never actually called anyone. Think about it. If you were running away, wouldn't you at least call someone at some point? Wouldn't you leave a voice message just to let people hear your voice and know you were okay? But Bernadette never did, because she couldn't, because she was already dead. And all of those texts, they were nothing more than the desperate, pathetic attempts of two murderers trying to cover up their crime. Scott and Sarah Walker thought they could trick everyone. They thought they were smart enough to keep their secret hidden. But in the end, their lies weren't enough. Imagine this. A 17-year-old girl disappears. Not a single trace left behind. No body, no evidence, just gone. That's what happened to Bernadette Walker. She got into that car with Scott Walker on July 18th, 2020, and from that moment on, she was never seen again. And that's not a figure of speech. That's not an exaggeration. She literally vanished. No footage of her anywhere. No credible sightings. No confirmed location. Nothing. And the police? They searched everywhere. They combed through the area. They investigated every possible lead. They did everything they could to find her. But they found nothing. Because Scott Walker, he made sure of that. Now, let's talk about him for a second. Because Scott wasn't some criminal mastermind. He wasn't some genius who pulled off the perfect crime. No, he was a liar, a manipulator, and a coward. And when he realized that Bernadette was a threat to his sick, twisted world, he did the only thing he could think of. He got rid of her. The how of it all, we don't know. Not for sure. We have suspicions. We have theories. But only Scott Walker knows what really happened in that car. Did he strangle her right then and there? Did he take her somewhere secluded first? Was it quick? Did she fight back? Did she beg for her life? We don't know. But what we do know is this: after Scott killed Bernadette, he had a new problem to deal with: what to do with her body. And this is where things get even darker, because Scott Walker had time. Remember, after he killed Bernadette, no one was looking for her yet. No one even knew she was missing. And that meant Scott had hours, maybe even days, to make sure she was never found. So what did he do? The police believe that after killing Bernadette, Scott disposed of her body in a way that made it nearly impossible to recover. And let's not sugarcoat that he erased her. Maybe he buried her in some remote, hidden place somewhere no one would think to look. A stretch of forest, an abandoned lot, a riverbank, Maybe he destroyed the evidence in another way, something so horrific we don't even want to consider it. Maybe he used his knowledge of the area, his understanding of what places were rarely visited, to make sure that no one would ever stumble upon her remains. But whatever he did, it worked. Because to this day, Bernadette Walker's body has never been found. And that's not just tragic. That's devastating. Because it means that her family never got closure. It means that her loved ones never got to lay her to rest. It means that even though Scott Walker was eventually caught, even though he was put on trial, he still had one last victory. He took away the truth. He took away the chance for Bernadette to be found. He took away any hope of giving her a proper goodbye. And the worst part, even in court, even when faced with all the evidence, even when it was painfully obvious that he was guilty, Scott Walker never said where she was. He kept his secret. He refused to tell the truth. Even now, as he rots in prison, he still holds the answer to the one question that truly matters. Where is Bernadette? And that is the most horrifying part of all. For weeks, Scott and Sarah Walker thought they had pulled it off. They thought their twisted little plan had worked. Bernadette was gone, and they were doing everything they could to make it seem like she was still out there, alive, just choosing to stay away. They had her phone. They were sending messages, making posts, keeping up the illusion that she had run away. And for a while, people believed it. Her friends were worried but not panicked. After all, the messages were still coming through. She was still talking. And no one wants to assume the worst, right? No one wants to believe that something truly awful has happened to someone they love. But the thing about a lie, it only works if you can keep it straight. And Scott and Sarah, they couldn't. It started with the messages. At first, they were convincing. Short, vague, just enough to make it seem like Bernadette was keeping her distance. But over time, people started to notice things. The way Bernadette was texting felt off. The wording didn't sound like her. The way the messages were structured, the tone, it didn't match the way she normally spoke. It was subtle, but her friends could tell. And then came the biggest red flag. She never called. Not once. Not a single voicemail. Not a single voice message. Not even a quick whispered, "I'm okay." Nothing. Just text after text, as if she suddenly forgot how to use a voice. That was the first crack. Then came the phone activity. The police, once they got involved, started looking at where Bernadette's phone had been used. They checked the timestamps, the locations. And guess what? It wasn't moving like a normal runaway's phone would. Think about it, if you run away, your phone moves with you, right? You're in different locations, different areas. You might turn it off sometimes, but when you turn it back on, you're somewhere new. The police can track that. But Bernadette's phone, it was staying in one general area. And where was that? Near her home. Not across the country. Not moving around like someone trying to avoid being found. It was right where Scott and Sarah were. And then, the inconsistencies. Scott and Sarah were texting each other pretending to be Bernadette, but they weren't being careful. Sometimes they got their story mixed up. One message would say one thing. A later message would contradict it. The timeline didn't add up. The excuses didn't make sense. And the police? Then came the phone records. Because when you're trying to cover up a crime, the last thing you want is for someone to start pulling phone logs. But that's exactly what the police did. They found that Scott and Sarah were using Bernadette's phone long after she was last seen alive. And not just for a few days. For weeks, they were checking her messages, reading them, replying to them. But they made mistakes. They replied too quickly to some texts. They ignored others that Bernadette normally wouldn't have. And when the police confronted them about it, their explanations were a mess. They had no good reason why Bernadette's phone had stayed near their home. No good reason why her tone in texts had changed. No good reason why they had been the ones accessing her accounts. And that's when the walls started closing in. Because once the police knew the messages were fake, that meant only one thing: Bernadette hadn't been the one sending them. And if she wasn't sending them, then where was she? That's when Scott and Sarah realized they had run out of time. Their entire story, their entire cover-up, had just fallen apart. For 6 weeks, Scott and Sarah Walker thought they had gotten away with it. 6 weeks of living their normal lives, pretending everything was fine, while knowing exactly what they had done. They were careful, at least they thought they were. They had spent days crafting their cover-up, making it seem like Bernadette was still alive, still out there somewhere, just choosing to stay away. They had her phone. They were sending texts, replying to messages, even creating fake conversations to keep up the illusion. And at first, people bought it. Her friends, her family, no one wanted to assume the worst. After all, teenagers run away all the time, right? Maybe she was just angry. Maybe she needed space. Maybe she'd come back when she was ready. But as the weeks passed, things stopped adding up. The way Bernadette was texting felt wrong. The way her phone never moved locations was suspicious. The way Scott and Sarah were behaving, not panicked, not desperate, not like parents who had just lost their child, was starting to raise red flags. And then, the police started digging deeper. The first major crack in their story came when detectives analyzed Bernadette's phone records. They quickly realized that the texts being sent weren't normal. The timing was off. The wording didn't match how she usually spoke. And most importantly, there were no calls, no voicemails, no audio messages, nothing. If Bernadette had truly run away, wouldn't she have called someone? Wouldn't she have left at least one message to let someone hear her voice? But she didn't, because she couldn't, because she was already dead. Then the police checked the cell tower data. If Bernadette was on the run, her phone should have been pinging in different areas, moving, traveling, showing signs of a girl on the go. Instead, her phone had stayed in one place. And that place, right near Scott and Sarah Walker's home. That was it. That was the moment the police knew. Scott and Sarah weren't searching for their missing daughter. They weren't worried about where she was. They weren't trying to bring her home. They were covering something up. And once the police saw that, it was game over. 6 weeks after Bernadette was last seen alive, the police came knocking. Scott Walker and Sarah Walker were arrested. And just like that, their carefully constructed web of lies collapsed around them. When the case finally went to court, everything, the lies, the deception, the cold-blooded murder, was laid bare for the world to see. Scott Walker had spent weeks pretending Bernadette was alive, manipulating the truth, covering his tracks. He thought he had done enough. He thought there was no way they could prove what he had done. But the evidence? It spoke for itself. There was no body, but that didn't matter. The digital footprints, the phone activity, the fake messages, the inconsistencies in their statements, everything pointed to one inescapable truth. Bernadette Walker was dead, and Scott Walker had killed her. When the trial began, Scott did what most cowards do. He denied everything. He insisted that Bernadette had run away, that he had dropped her off and never saw her again. He claimed he had nothing to do with it, despite all the evidence pointing straight at him. But the prosecution wasn't buying it. They painted the real picture, the one Scott didn't want anyone to see. The one where he silenced Bernadette after she accused him of sexual abuse. The one where he drove her away from her grandparents' house that day, knowing she would never come back. The one where he coldly disposed of her body and then spent weeks faking messages to make it seem like she was still alive. And the jury, they saw right through him. It was a unanimous decision. Scott Walker was found guilty of murder. And when sentencing day came, the judge made sure he would never walk free again. Life in prison. Minimum of 32 years before parole. 32 years behind bars before he could even think about seeing the outside world again. And even then, there was no guarantee he would ever be released. The judge made it clear Scott Walker was a dangerous man, a predator, and he had shown zero remorse for what he had done. But Scott wasn't the only one standing trial. Sarah Walker, the woman who was supposed to be Bernadette's mother, the woman who was supposed to protect her, was just as guilty in the eyes of the law. No, she hadn't pulled the trigger. No, she hadn't strangled Bernadette with her own hands. But she hadn't done a damn thing to stop it either. She knew. She knew Bernadette wasn't coming home. She knew Scott had killed her. And what did she do? Did she call the police? Did she tell the truth? Did she even try to get justice for her daughter? No, she helped him cover it up. She sat there sending fake texts from Bernadette's phone, playing along with the lie, trying to make the world believe her daughter was alive, when she knew full well that she was dead. And for that, she had to face the consequences. Sarah Walker was sentenced to 15 years in prison. 15 years for helping cover up the murder of her own daughter. And even in court, even as the verdicts were read, neither of them, not Scott, not Sarah, showed any real remorse. They refused to say what had really happened that day. They refused to tell the truth about what they had done to Bernadette's body. Even as they were led away in handcuffs, they held on to their last, disgusting secret. But in the end, it didn't matter, because justice had been served. Bernadette Walker was just 17 years old when she made the incredibly brave decision to speak up against the abuse she had suffered at the hands of her stepfather, Scott Walker. She could have stayed silent, could have carried that burden alone, but she chose to fight back. She chose to tell the truth. And for that, she lost her life. Her bravery cost her everything. Scott Walker, a man who had spent years controlling and manipulating Bernadette, knew that if her allegations were taken seriously, his world would come crashing down. He knew the consequences. He knew that if people believed Bernadette, he would lose everything: his freedom, his reputation, his control. So, he did what monsters do. He made sure she would never speak again. Bernadette's life was stolen by someone who should have protected her, someone who should have been a father figure, but instead he was her greatest danger. And what makes it even worse, her own mother helped cover it up. But while Scott and Sarah Walker thought they could erase her, thought they could make her disappear without a trace, they were wrong. Because Bernadette's story didn't end with her murder. Her voice may have been silenced that day, but her story, it lives on. Bernadette's courage in speaking up is a reminder that we should always listen to victims, always fight for justice, and never let abusers walk free simply because their victims can no longer speak. She was just 17. She had dreams, she had a future, she had her whole life ahead of her, and it was stolen. But what we must do is make sure her story is never forgotten, that her bravery is never ignored, that no victim ever feels like their voice doesn't matter, because it does. And because of Bernadette, more people will listen, more people will believe, more people will fight for justice. That is her legacy.